Welcome, pilgrims and pilgrim researchers. My name is Matthew Anderson. I am a professor, part-time professor, sessional lecturer at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, Canada, and at Concordia University, Montreal, Canada. And my presentation is called "What is Pilgrimage Good For? Unhomeness and Settler Colonialism." The précis, or the summary of the paper, is as follows. Many forms of pilgrimage try to alienate the pilgrim from his or her usual self-understandings derived from home and routine. Because of this, pilgrimage can be a powerful tool for decolonization. In this paper, I explore aspects of Freud's Unheimlich, the uncanny, to show how the unhomeness most pilgrimage experiences attempt to inculcate in a pilgrim is a useful first step for settler descendants to reorient themselves around indigenous emphases, which also happen to be the usual mark of pilgrim shrines: land, story, relation, and spirit. So, the introduction. Beyond definitions, I begin my presentation with the question, what is pilgrimage good for? By starting with the question, what is pilgrimage good for, you likely notice that I jumped over a more common question that researchers often grapple with first, namely, what is pilgrimage? Asking the functional question leaves the ontological question for the moment unanswered. In fact, asking what pilgrimage does rather than what pilgrimage is immediately changes our approach from looking for a static and self-contained phenomenon to an admission that pilgrimage, and with it pilgrimage studies, is inescapably relational, evolving, and open-ended. We all know how hard it is to define pilgrimage. The definitional problem has troubled academics ever since Victor and Edith Turner made pilgrimage studies a field almost 60 years ago now. Like a teenager squeezing through a fence, pilgrimage outwits our attempts to define it as a religious action, or alternatively as just tourism, or even as a phenomenon within the academic disciplines of ritual studies or anthropology. Centuries ago in the West, pilgrimage fled the confines of its religious parentage, only for its secular descendants to linger in the doorways of cathedrals, shrines, sacred springs, and temples. Pilgrimage has sometimes become tourism, sometimes economic development, sometimes protest, sometimes therapy, sometimes performance art, sometimes ecological conversation, sometimes worship, sometimes a prelude to war, and occasionally a first step to peace. The study of pilgrimage is similarly multivalent and multidisciplinary. The variety of its forms makes pilgrimage endlessly interesting, but also fairly confusing. What is the role of ritual, of shrine, and of belief, of itinerancy on the one hand and of sacred place on the other? Does a pilgrimage require healing, saints, temples, visions or conversions, blessings? Does it require religion? What does a long walk along the Appalachian Trail have to do with Mecca or Lourdes, where you can fly in and stay at a five-star hotel? What do pilgrims dropping flowers along the Ganges and pilgrims placing pebbles along the Camino Frances have in common? And what about the 2,000-kilometer walk through the snow of Indigenous youth to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, in the middle of winter in order to protest a lack of clean water? What about Indigenous water walks, where the water is itself considered a pilgrimage partner? Then there is the question of whether pilgrimage has to arise from an ancient tradition. Is the relatively recent and naturalized St. Olaf Way in Norway as legitimate, whatever legitimate means, as the ancient path that led to Trondheim while the Saint King's body was still there before it went missing in the Reformation? Finally, one must consider the multiplicity of activities of different sorts that can happen even within a supposedly single experience of pilgrimage. A pilgrim might take in a morning art show, pray at a shrine at noon, and in the evening purchase trinkets at a local gift shop. Does the pilgrim's pilgrimage nature turn on and off again with each activity? Sharenda Holland Barler is certainly right to characterize pilgrimage as what she says, a multifunctional endeavor. And as if these questions are not enough, in our study, we pilgrim scholars are faced by similarly daunting methodological issues. To study pilgrimage, should we use the tools of anthropology, of ritual studies, of touristic studies, of musicology, of medieval or ancient history, or of sociology? Should we and can we combine disciplines? In practice, of course, the question is moot. The field of pilgrimage studies has become truly multidisciplinary, but not always happily so. What is surprising to me is that despite George Greenia's admonition that, quote, religious studies is the most obvious home of research on pilgrimage, end quote, So few people, at least in the English-speaking world, study it from a religious studies or theological point of view. Then there is the frequent, unspoken, and perhaps slightly embarrassing question at every pilgrimage colloquium. Can one be a pilgrim as well as a pilgrimage studies researcher? Is it possible to be on pilgrimage and study it at the same time? De facto, many of us are. But is objectivity possible or even desirable for both practitioner pilgrims and academics of pilgrimage studies? How does active participation, being embedded, affect one's research on the one hand and one's pilgrim experience on the other? This is the issue of objectivity, or perhaps more accurately, I would prefer to say of positionality. Some research has tended to fall off of one side or another of positionality, either trying too hard to appear to be objective in some social scientific way and succeeding in hiding biases from no one, or alternatively passing off communal diaries, for example, as research without sufficient grounding in methodology. In practice, I've often used Kathleen Jenkins and the Institute for Pilgrimage Studies as a pithy statement that pilgrimage is, quote, travel for transformation, end quote. I prefer probably George Greeny's fine-tuning of that phrase to travel for transcendence. This definition allows for a corporate and community dimension, unlike Linda K. Davidson and David Gitlitz's definition that pilgrimage is, quote, a quest, a journey in search of an experience that will affect the kind of change that will make a difference to the individual's life or spirit. In Japan, the word junrei roughly translates as, quote, going around and worshiping, according to John Schultz. André Bruyette calls pilgrimage, quote, a journey inscribed in time, end quote, which is good, but perhaps doesn't quite say enough. I should mention that Bruyette does go on to add both content and nuance to that phrase. Notice that all the definitions I've mentioned so far are in some way tied to movement rather than to a single sacred or transformative space. Behind all of these is the fact that one of the problems with pilgrimage, as Ian Reeder has helpfully pointed out, is that the word is an English word, and as such arises from a Western background and a Christian-informed constellation of associated meanings. Yet because of the universality of English, we are forced to use the word pilgrimage as sort of a catch-all for activities that don't always fit the word but may only resemble it, and for which other languages with their own culturally inscribed practices often have multiple terms. In the recent book that he co-authored with me, titled Our Home and Treaty Land, Indigenous author and theologian Ray Aldred points out that Indigenous people, including the Nehiyaw or Cree, are among those who do not have a specific word for pilgrimage. They do, however, have a word for journey. In Cree, that word is Pimachihawan. What is fascinating is that this word can also be the word for living or even culture. Aldred notes, quote, it says something about our Cree way of being in the world that our word for walking or journey can be the word that we use to talk about living, end quote. That makes the word both foundational and relational. Perhaps there is a clue here for us pilgrimage researchers. If journeying is simply life and culture, then what does that tell us about the phenomenology behind pilgrimage? I maintain that the phenomenology is rooted in the action of ritual or ceremony. Pilgrimage is such an internally varied phenomenon that a good analogy might be sports. Consider the fact that both chess and basketball are recognized sports. In the set of activities called sports or games, these two things, chess and basketball, each have a membership, and yet they are in many ways more different from each other than they are similar, as are Lourdes and the Hajj, for instance. Questioning what pilgrimage is almost inevitably requires a privileging of one type of the practice or its study over another. For academics, it may mean privileging the type of pilgrimage we study over the type of pilgrimage others study. Here, we say, drawing a fence around our particular expertise. This thing that I'm publishing papers in, this is pilgrimage. That over there, I'm not so sure. Notice how much like claiming territory this type of exclusivizing scholarship can be. Definitions can operate as a way of claiming ownership of colonizing. An emphasis on definition also tends to lead to a diachronic rather than a synchronic way of looking at a phenomenon. Defining pilgrimage as this or that might imply that we believe that there was a pristine or an original starting point from which all other examples have deviated. Holding to firm definitions of pilgrimage tends to require a kind of a myth of origins. That is true whether we take as a starting point medieval Christian pilgrimage or ancient Jewish festival pilgrimage or early Hindu pilgrimage. or Celtic peregrination, or what instructions the Buddha gave or did not give on how to do pilgrimage after his death. Here again, I'm informed by what Raymond Aldred wrote. One of the fundamental differences, he says, between the Europeans who arrived here as colonizers of Turtle Island and the First Nations that they encountered was that for many of the Europeans, the goal was not proper connection either to others or to the land. Rather, the goal of the settlers was the opposite of journeying. It was building a kingdom, in other words, ownership. The capitalist commodification of the university means that scholars are strongly encouraged to establish ownership, in a sense, of their own niche specialty within the academic world. We build kingdoms of expertise. We need to do this. The system requires this of us in order to try to obtain or to keep academic positions. Perhaps unconsciously, a pilgrimage scholar's desire to define pilgrimage can represent the hopes of identifying a territory that can then be exploited, extracting value from it as much as we would with any other resource. To avoid such ownership claims and to begin to decolonize my own approach to pilgrimage, I'd like to start then from the functional view. For the moment, I would like to borrow an Indigenous concept in order to help illuminate what I mean. That concept is ceremony. I borrow that term with respect and thanks both from Sean Wilson, who uses it in his book, Research is Ceremony, and from the Indigenous friends with whom I've had the privilege of walking. A ceremonial point of view shifts the focus on a set of actions from the question, what is this action, to the question, what social and community purpose does this action accomplish? So in terms of pilgrimage, what happens in a pilgrimage? My specific concern is decolonization. This concern, by nature, is functional. Thinking about how pilgrimage can help those of us who live in the global north try to decolonize ourselves has brought me back to one of the first words that I learned when I encountered the field of pilgrimage studies. It's a word that I've since tried to move away from, but which keeps coming back. And that word is liminality. You all know the word. It comes from the research of the Turners, of Van Gennep, and of Paul Stenner. None of these invented the concept. They identified it in human rituals or ceremonies. There's that term again, bringing us back to Indigenous understandings. There's something about pilgrimage when understood as ritual action or ceremony that is intended to create liminality. Bleuchel recognizes this when he writes in his book, quote, to be on pilgrimage is still to be in a world and even existentially to have a world, but now in the mode of not belonging entirely to it, end quote. Liminality in pilgrimage is as old as the fact that from the beginning, pilgrimage took pilgrims outside their own doorways and into other not quite normal places made holy by temples, oracles, saints, relics, divine commandments, and holy happenings. Pilgrims went into these grottos and shrines and mountain spaces in order to be transformed and to develop new or restored relations with the Buddha, the deity, the saints, Jesus, a Sufi holy person, or Elvis. One of the first identified characteristics of pilgrimage was this functional link then between ceremony, although it was not always called that, and liminality. That link becomes visible as soon as we move from what pilgrimage is to a focus on what pilgrimage does. Displacement requires ceremony. The specific term I'd like to propose for one way that pilgrimage works to move a pilgrim into a liminal state is the word unhoming. There's the word, unhoming. Unhoming makes pilgrims into what the word peregrinus first meant, a stranger, foreigner. To paraphrase the ancient Greek Tyrteus, pilgrimage is a form of voluntary banishment that makes the pilgrim, quote, in all the world a stranger, end quote. But I would add, most especially, a stranger to themselves and their own home. Greenia identified a parallel process and calls it the fourth aspect of this phenomenon, an elision, he says, or an effacement of self. Pilgrimage takes pilgrims away from their homes and families for a period and places them elsewhere. We go somewhere else, but we always take ourselves with us. Eklund writes, we think of a path as a way to something else, toward the future and what lies ahead, but a path also points backward to the time and the place we come from, end quote. On the lands where scholars like me represent settler descendants, this unhoming, this being outside and away from what we think of as home, is a necessary first step for non-Indigenous inhabitants of such lands to decolonize themselves. To put it another way, the process of unhoming ourselves, or being outside and away from our usual identities of home, is a necessary first step for non-Indigenous inhabitants of occupied lands to decolonize themselves. Settler descendants cannot begin to decolonize themselves or their research without the shock of realizing their status as strangers and mendicants on the very territories they once consciously or unconsciously considered home. By placing pilgrims into a time and a space of uneasiness, of intentional self-alienation involving a suspension of one's usual definitions of identity and home, pilgrimage, especially walking pilgrimage, can encourage decolonization. The kind of pilgrimage I propose can become a journey of identity, but only insofar as it moves one toward new relations, reinforced through physical movement. No matter how different from each other they may be, all pilgrimages attempt to move pilgrims away from and outside of their usual and comfortable daily routines. Pilgrimages of all kinds, secular, religious, Eastern, Western, even virtual pilgrimages, generally work the same way. They illustrate with ceremonies and clothing and badges how they intend to take the pilgrim out of his or her quotidian into a special space where transformation can take place. This is hardly a discovery. Most pilgrim traditions, in fact, go to great efforts to advertise that such displacement is exactly what they're trying to accomplish. Van Gennep, whose treatment of ceremonies unfortunately bears some of the datedness of its mid-20th century origins, identifies these as what he calls threshold rites. One of the most obvious ways that pilgrimages mark unhomeness is by setting the pilgrimage apart through the wearing of special clothing. Depending on the tradition, pilgrims may wear special hats, tunics, handkerchiefs, symbols, badges, staffs, keen hiking boots, or bare feet. Putting on the clothing happens even before one steps out the door. By donning the clothing, the pilgrim marks that simply the intention of going on pilgrimage has already separated them from their usual surroundings. One dons the state or the function of pilgrimage together with the clothing. Muslims on the way to the Hajj not only wear ihram, the same word can also be defined as the state of being on pilgrimage, in which the pilgrim cannot cut hair or nails, hunt or kill, have sex, or wear jewelry or perfume. Similarly, the website shikokuhenrotrail.com begins with how to wear the Shikoku pilgrim's outfit. Quote, start with a waist or thigh-length, lightweight white cotton vest, it suggests. This represents a henro's burial shroud. Traditionally, this is what you were buried in if you died while on the trail, end quote. Ian Reeder adds that the bamboo hat worn by Shikoku pilgrims represents the pilgrim's coffin and is, quote, inscribed with a poem signifying the transience of life, as well as a staff that symbolizes the pilgrim's gravestone and bears a mortuary inscription, end quote. Note the link between pilgrimage and death, which exists in multiple world traditions. Supposedly, medieval Christian pilgrims were encouraged to write their last will and testaments before leaving. Celtic or insular pilgrims boarded a boat without oars, in some cases, giving themselves over to where the winds might take them, heading to an unknown destination they called, quote, their place of resurrection, that is, the place of their death. Whether a henro or a peregrine, it's hard to think of a better example of marking unhomeness than living as if one were already potentially dead. Death to oneself or death to one's former life is a relatively common aspirational goal of some pilgrimages. In practice, how that works out is the putative death, at least temporarily, of one's sense of security, that is, one's sense of home. On the surface, unhomeness sounds easy to explain. It means that one is at least temporarily without the accustomed habits of home, without even the sense of belonging that comes with a place, whether or not one is actually there. This is its simplest meaning. Unhomeness is something like displacement. However, you may also recognize that the term unhomeness sounds familiar from the field of psychology. It was Freud who especially worked with this term. When I first used the word in an article, I adapted it from this Freudian concept called Unheimlich in German. Unheimlich is usually translated into English as uncanny. Most often it's used to describe the feelings we have when faced with a phenomenon of the familiar becoming terrifying or frightening in some way. Unheimlich is that feeling of shock that would happen if a beloved cat or dog came into our house only to be revealed to suddenly have rabies. The word has tended to mean something that is horrifying in a way that only happens when our expectations are subverted, when what should be comfortable becomes terrible, sort of like finding a snake in your shoe. However, while writing on Unheimlich, Freud also discussed the more basic meaning of the word as discomfort, especially discomfort in a place where we once felt at home. Think perhaps of making a visit back to the place where you grew up or spent your youth and feeling that you have outgrown that house or that town. This more basic sense of the word as no longer familiar or no longer belonging is the way I'm using it here. But I'm also interested in a third tangent that Freud takes in his essay on Unheimlich. Using quotations from literature, Freud showed that the word Unheimlich could also have a third meaning that touches on decolonization more directly. In this meaning, Unheimlich can also denote something that was once hidden or secret being revealed. This third meaning of Unheimlich has special significance for decolonization. For many Canadians, and I'm a Canadian, the kind of shock Freud describes happened with the news of Indigenous groups recovering and reburying the bodies of their children who died over the course of the last century while at the so-called residential schools, which were actually assimilation and labor institutions in most cases, set up by the Canadian government and run by the churches. I should probably point out here that such schools also existed in the United States, but have not been as widely publicized. There is, or there should be, a severe existential crisis, a shock, arising from the realization of the fact that the so-called Indian residential schools in Canada actually came equipped with cemeteries, and why that might be so. In fact, the actual unheimlich, or uncanny moment, came for many Canadians on the Canada Day, immediately following the initial news stories concerning the bodies. It was the uncanny, or the unheimlich, feeling of the familiar and comfortable maple leaf having turned to an unfamiliar symbol of repression and terror. With this in mind, let's return to the question, what does pilgrimage do? We have learned that pilgrimage, like some other ceremonies or rituals, helps take away, or at least momentarily suspend, identity. That's its aim, at least. It takes the pilgrim into a liminal space where perhaps they might make new associations. In this context, I want to repeat that Indigenous ceremonies also work to suspend current identities in order to create new relations, either with newcomers or with other creatures, or within families or nations. In his book, Research is Ceremony, Wilson points out that, quote, Indigenous epistemology has systems of knowledge built on relationships, end quote. In practical terms, Aldred notes that in treaty making, which is a form of ceremony, First Nations inevitably alter their group identity in order to make other groups family relations, and points out that the failures of settler colonial society stem precisely from their failure to engage honestly in that process of kinship making. The dilemma of being a settler descendant is that people like me are no longer from the countries where our ancestors emigrated, yet neither are we quite from the new place, the soil on which our ancestors settled. In my case, I'm no longer European, but neither am I Indigenous. This is a state of being that is profoundly, or can be profoundly, troubled. It is unheimlich. Our home is no longer in the countries our ancestors left behind, but we are not holding up the agreements that gave us our homes here. In a class that I teach at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, on religions and the environmental crisis, I ask my students to close their eyes and picture the landscape that comes to mind when I ask them to think of home. When I close my eyes and I do this, I do not see what my grandparents saw, the mountains of Norway. I see the northern Great Plains of North America, or Turtle Island, as the Anishinaabe people call it. I see trembling aspen. I smell sage and dry prairie grasses. When I picture home, I believe that I see much the same landscape, or much the same landscape comes to mind for me as does for my Indigenous co-author, Raymond Aldred. We come from almost precisely the same area, the same land, but we have experienced it very differently. My ancestors stole that land from his. To redress those actions in at least some way, I must go through a stage of not feeling quite at home there, but rather being and walking unhomed. Eva Mackey notes that, quote, uncertainty, almost always seen as a negative and a threatening phenomenon, can indeed, must also be embraced as a key to creativity and imaginative visions that depend on unsettling settled expectations and self-evident settler states of feeling, end quote. To this point, I've talked about the useful ways that pilgrimage accomplishes unhomeness. Yet most traditions of pilgrimage don't end with instilling a sense of unhomeness, leaving pilgrims as mendicants without an identity. I'm aware that some forms, by the way, of Celtic peregrination may be argued to do this, but I'd reply that it was in service of what was intended to be a heavenly home. And the same may be true of Parivraja, or holy wandering in Hindu traditions, and of Islamic Javanese practices of the pilgrim called musafir. Decolonizing pilgrimage does not end with wandering. If it does what it's supposed to do as ritual or ceremony, walking and decolonizing pilgrimage is a two-stage process. It upsets our normal patterns of belonging, but then it opens us up to new attachments, to a new corporate and personal identity. According to Van Gennep, ceremonies recognize that human life, quote, resembles nature from which neither the individual nor the society stand independent, end quote. In this way, decolonizing pilgrimage fulfills the common function of some pilgrimages as education or edification, education being a particularly effective and long-lived form of transformation. Albertus Laksana has pointed out that the formative and pedagogical functions, goals and functions of many global traditions of pilgrimage. He notes how pilgrimages to the Hajj are often preceded by an extended period of religious instruction. In ancient Christian traditions, as well as contemporary Japanese pilgrimage, the spiritual quest is often twinned with a seeking after location-based knowledge that is quite similar to what I'm suggesting here, an education process, a preparation in education. This new knowledge is gained through practice or experience. It might result in what Heather Warfield identifies as the ultimate state of pilgrimage, what she calls a quote, developmental experience, end quote, namely the integration stage. Important for my argument is that the pilgrimage journey inevitably places us among new relations and forges those relations. This is where I need to add a word of caution, maybe. If you've been listening carefully to my description of the two phases of decolonizing through pilgrimage, they may sound familiar. Stage one was unhomeness, and I'm about to state that stage two is, quote, new identity formation as a treaty person, end quote. Those familiar with pilgrimage theory could accuse me of simply recycling the old and tired pilgrimage studies cliches of liminality on the first hand and communitas on the second, under new names. And there'd be some truth to that critique. But humans are humans, and status definitions don't disappear even when they're supposed to. There's no real status egalitarianism on pilgrimage, despite its publicity. For instance, status indicators, such as the kind of house one lives in or car one drives, perhaps, may be equalized, for instance, on the Camino. But there, the usual question is often, how far have you walked? Or how many times? And it's not just Spain. Even though the two-part ihram is supposed to mark all Muslim pilgrims to Mecca as equal, there is still clearly a difference between those who wear the outfit after arriving by bus and those who put it on while deplaning from a private jet. In other words, there have always been the aspirational effects of pilgrimage and the real concrete embodiments. The outward changes of status indicated by pilgrimage clothing or badges always remains an imperfect reflection, in other words, of whatever inward changes might be happening. The same is true of this proposal for a pilgrimage paradigm of decolonization. The extent to which pilgrimage unhomes and then resituates a pilgrim within a new identity depends to a great extent on how much that person is open to hearing new truths. In my case, for instance, truths concerning the Indian residential schools, or the police actions against Mi'kmaq fishers, or of local white residents against Mohawk barricades. The question, what is pilgrimage good for, is not the same as what does pilgrimage always accomplish? They're not the same. Further, because pilgrimage is both an embodied and a community, and so relational activity, pilgrims bring to it those elements which make up both communal and personal identity. One of the less well-examined, but perhaps most important elements here is gender. A pilgrim not only has a gender, but consciously or unconsciously performs gender while on pilgrimage. In terms of decolonizing pilgrimages, to what extent a person has been trained toward autonomy, community, the ability or the willingness to engage in self-examination, or the willingness to form new relations may have more to do with social expectations around gender than most settler-descendant pilgrims may realize or be willing to admit. Finally, I should note here what might be an unpopular opinion. There's nothing about pilgrimage itself that necessarily leads to decolonization or to justice. Movement reinforces learning, which is one of the great things about pilgrimage. Movement reinforces learning, but it can as easily reinforce the learning of hate as of love. In fact, from the Crusades to convoys of racist truckers to Civil War battlefields, history is full of pilgrimages undertaken for the purpose of reinforcing hate or asserting dominance over others. Pilgrimage is effective at reinforcing intentions for good or ill. To that end, what I propose here is pilgrimage, of course, that reinforces intentions toward justice and right treaty relations. Historically, pilgrim shrines are places where, firstly, stories, perhaps of appearances or miracles or martyrdoms, gather around specific places, shrines, and create ongoing relations between the pilgrim and the venerated person, space, or object within a sacred or a holy setting. These four characteristics of pilgrimage, place, stories, relations, and the holy or spirituality, are also important to decolonizing pilgrimage because these are consistent emphases also of indigenous writing and research unconnected to pilgrimages or their shrines. In either domain, each has its distinct colonizing role: place, stories, relations, spirituality. First, place or land. The land crossed must be the territory that has been colonized and needs to be recognized in a new way by the settler descendant pilgrim. As Ken Wilson points out, in indigenous paradigms, quote, there is no distinction made between relationships that are made with other people and those relationships made with our environment, end quote, including land. What I believe that pilgrimage studies can add to this understanding is that the land, which in indigenous systems of thought includes the people in a relational oneness, is itself the ritual sacred object. That is, the land is the shrine. The land is the sacred object which acts upon the settler colonial or a settler descendant pilgrim. Secondly, stories. So first land, second stories. The stories pilgrims must learn and must hear are truth-telling narratives of colonization, of sovereignty over land, and in our case, of treaties that allowed land to be shared but were never intended to give sovereignty to the colonizers. In decolonizing pilgrimage, if one is a settler descendant, it is what we used to think of as our stories, our settler stories that need changing, our supposed territories that need to be told stories about in more accurate ways, and our relations that need redoing. Thirdly, so land, stories, relations. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the relations established are not historical artifacts, that is, learning about a past, but must be ongoing relations, that is, contemporary relations, which is why the relations, or in pilgrimage studies terms, communitas, to be established must be with indigenous persons through treaty in this kind of decolonizing pilgrimage. And finally, number 4, land, stories, relation, spirit, or holiness. The entirety of the pilgrimage or pilgrimages is viewed through that lens of spirituality. For observers such as Van Gennep, from the midpoint of the 20th century and an aloof Western vantage, spirituality, Gennep believed, was the mark of a primitive mind. Quote, among semi-civilized peoples, he wrote in 1960, such acts as rites of passage are enveloped in ceremonies, since to the semi-civilized mind, no act is free from the sacred, end quote. Well, from my own point of view, I would argue that Van Gennep's attitude towards spirituality, that his fear of it, marked his time and his particular social location, just as much as any so-called semi-civilized people that he studied. Since indigenous identity is formed in a spiritual relationship to a very specific territory or land, so must be the journey of the decolonizing pilgrim. Aldred states the following, quote, when we journey on this land, the heart of Cree's spirituality and knowledge tells us that we were created for this land, that on it we are all related either by being original peoples or by treaty, if such treaties are respected and honored. It tells us that that is why we belong here, end quote. Since it is precisely the land of colonization that is at issue, decolonizing pilgrimages must take place on indigenous territory, knowing that all of Turtle Island is indigenous territory, in a way that underlines both respect and a willingness to relearn and be resituated. So, for instance, a Canadian like myself may go on pilgrimage in Shikoku or Spain, walking alone or in the company of interesting fellow pilgrims, and they may happen to meet very interesting folks along the way, but such a pilgrimage is not decolonizing. Decolonizing pilgrimage is not solitary. It is not a solution for a lost job, a prognosis of cancer, a milestone birthday, or a divorce. Such pilgrimages may be liberating and healing if gone on for those reasons, but they are not decolonizing. Decolonizing pilgrimage must be undertaken on colonized territories that need to be reframed as a base for national and personal identity, and in conjunction with Indigenous persons or groups who either walk with the pilgrims or otherwise act as mentors or spiritual guides, as Ken Wilson and I have stated elsewhere. To return to the origin language of contemporary pilgrimage studies, the land in this case becomes itself the ternarian symbol vehicle. It is the land which becomes an active and even sacred signifier that changes the ways in which it acts on the signified, that is, the pilgrim, or the pilgrims in relational community. As the Turners put it, quote, new significance may be generated as devotees associate the particularized, personalized image with their own hopes and sorrows as members of a particular community with a specific history, and I would say a specific settler colonial history in this case. The way that ceremony acts in practical, political, social, and spiritual ways on both signifier and signified returns us one final time to that opening question, what does pilgrimage do? It can sometimes, if engaged honestly, momentarily suspend certain aspects of our status quo. It can pivot us away from our daily lives and our assumed identities. Walking pilgrimage reinforces learning through our bodies. Specifically, it facilitates learning what might be called the indigenous placedness of colonial settler territories. Again, as Wilson puts it, quote, placeness in this formulation represents the sense of coming to know the land through which one is walking in a deeper way, end quote. Greenian notes that pilgrimages often bear a sense of what he calls, quote, a latent ingathered essence waiting to be recovered from beyond the landscapes we normally inhabit, including the social ones, end quote. In the brief and tentative liminal space opened up by the time away from our daily routines, pilgrimage can allow those of us who are settler descendants on stolen land to see how we have benefited from colonization and what responsibilities we must take on in order to have an identity more liberated from hypocrisy and respectful of those still sovereign on those territories. The real physical movement of pilgrimage helps initiate and reinforce interior transformations. Embodied learning is simply good pedagogy. Add to this the momentum of most pilgrimages toward unhoming, to separation from the routine, and you have a ritual action with at least the capability to separate the pilgrim from their usual senses of belonging and perhaps entitlement. Through actual physical journeys on foot, I have learned and helped my students to learn much more about the dealings, or more often misdealings, of governments, communities, churches, and settler-descended individuals with Indigenous peoples in this place, where I'm speaking today. If we who are non-Indigenous want to begin to decolonize ourselves, physical movement helps us to walk the walk of our many university, church, and government statements expressing repentance for the past or the hope for better and future relations. Pilgrimage's malleability opens it up as a powerful tool for a two-stage process that begins with unhomeness, self-alienation, and decolonization. Thank you.